the Communications and Outreach Coordinator at Pendle Hill. I'm delighted to see all of you. As you can tell by all the chairs we have set up, we had about 70 people register in advance for this. And as usual, some people will not show up, but we're expecting a good-sized crowd, so we're glad that you are here to hear this phenomenal poet, prophet, peacemaker, Pádraig Ó Tuama. Before we get started, I would like to invite you all to turn off your cell phones, your beepers, your pagers, your noisemakers of any sort. That would be very helpful. Secondly, we are not live streaming this event this evening as we often do, but we are recording it so that you'll be able to look at it again, and those of your friends who were not able to make it this evening can view it on our YouTube channel, which is Pendle Hill USA. Pendle Hill USA. It should be up in the next day or so.
A year.
Those of you who are accustomed to being at Pendle Hill for our Monday evening events will know that before we go to our main event, I fill this with some commercial space to let you know what's coming up. On November 4th is our first Monday. And our events generally are on the first Monday of every month, but we also have occasions when we can have special guests with us, as in this evening. Next Monday, November 4, we have an opportunity to screen a film that's just debuted called Blood Memory. And it was produced by two wonderful friends who were with us for our Truth and Healing Quaker Seeking Right relationship with Indigenous peoples in 2018. They finished their film, and it features the story of Sandy Whitehawk, who at the age of 18 months was removed from her family of the, yes, the name of it I want to get correct, Sikangu Lakota, and put into the home of, at some fair distance away from the reservation, and put into the home of white missionaries who raised her. This is partly the pilgrimage story of her going back to her roots, recovering her identity as a Native American in the Lakota tribe, and also helping bring other members of that stolen generation, where it continued the process of removal of Native Americans from their home and their tribe, even after passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was intended to stop that practice. At the same time that Sandy is undergoing her journey, there is another Native American who is taking a case to court to challenge the Indian Child Welfare Act. So this is a parallel story of what's going on with that litigation that goes up to the Supreme Court and Sandy's return to her, to the Rosebud Sioux tribe of her origins. On that occasion, we are starting early because we want to give time for people to raise questions with the producer of the film, Megan Whitmer, who will be coming here from Pittsburgh. So we're going to be starting uncustomarily early at 7 p.m. and ending at 9:30 to give time for questions and answers. There is a flyer out there with this. Pay attention to the time notice. We'll hope that you will be able to join us that evening. This coming weekend, many of you know George Lakey. He is doing 2 workshops.
Good night. 2 weekends.
2 weekends. November 9th, sorry. That's why we got, this is what life in a community is. They're here to make sure I don't make mistakes. Or if I do, to correct them. November 9, on Saturday, he is offering 2 workshops, one in the morning for anyone who is interested in hearing how we win, formulating a strategy for nonviolent direct action campaigning. In the afternoon, anyone who's taken the morning workshop, he is also offering, if you are a trained facilitator and would like to learn how to facilitate his workshop on how we win the strategy workshop of the morning, there is an application form on our website. George is reviewing those, and then we'll let you know whether you've been admitted. There is a flyer out there for this as well as any number of other things that are coming up. I don't want to take any more time. So I would like to introduce Francisco Burgos, who is our Director of Education, to introduce tonight's speaker. Oh, one other thing. So since we are recording at the end of Pádraig's talk, I will be able to come around with the microphone, and if you hold it right where I'm holding it, just a little bit below your lower lip, everybody will be able to hear both your question as well as Pádraig's response.
Let me try. Well, good evening. You know, chemistry is a good thing, because when you put together several components, something new and wonderful can happen. Yeah? Imagine when you put together in one person poetry, theology, and conflict mediation. Yeah? So this is Pádraig. This is not me. And I refer to that because there is an old word in Greek, poiesis, yeah? That is when you are able to bring something from nothing, to create something from nothing. And I think that you can make the relationship between poiesis and poetry, because it's the same root, it's exactly the same thing. So tonight, we will have the opportunity to share with Pádraig and listen to him read some poetry, making some poiesis, and I invite you to enjoy the evening. And I want to finalize this introduction just by reading you know, a short poem. The beginning of wisdom. The beginning of wisdom was when I learned the difference between believing in the truth and telling the truth about belief. Welcome, Pádraig.
Thank you very much to John, Francisco, and to Harjo for being such a warm place for this last weekend, and to all of you for taking some time out from your days. You've got other places to be, but you're here, so thank you very much. We gather here on Lenape land, land that we strive for and hope for recognition, for something called reconciliation, for something called justice, and for something of what can be recovered from all that is irrecoverable, in terms of the deep insight and the deep collaboration and co-creation about what community means that the Lenape people knew and maintained and tended for generation after generation. And we honour their foremothers and forefathers, past and present and future. So tonight I'm going to read some poems, some of mine, some of other people's. And the hope is that we can think about how poetry can warm the heart. I'm doing a PhD in poetry at the moment, and I'm the fourth of my 6 siblings to do PhDs. And my dad would always says, not one of them could help you if you hurt your finger. Apparently Dad has a serious anxiety about hurting his finger. So, he hasn't hurt any of them yet. But so I am very conscious about how poetry can seem to be something frippery, something airy, something that is not grounded into the meat of being. But I suppose I do think that we turn to poetry in times of death, we turn to poetry in times of war, we turn to poetry in times of celebration as well, and in times of deep lament and deep desire. And so that's the hope, is to turn to the kind of things that can nurture the meat of the heart, to be able to create and do something that's of measurable value. I know that we can question whether poetry is of measurable value, I don't really care if it is or isn't. I think it's the wrong question to ask about poetry. The right question is what helps us live a life? And poetry is part of the answer of that. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. I believe you do have a sheet of paper there with some other poems from different people. Really, we're just going to do some close readings of these things. And then I might ask a few questions. You're welcome to shout things out. I'll repeat them for the benefit of the microphone. And then there'll be a time for a Q&A towards the end as well. I'm going to start off with a poem of mine called Twisted. I've been very interested in form all of my life, form when it comes to poetry. And I've been writing a lot of sonnets lately, and I have a sonnet here called Twisted. Here it is. Twisted. It's everywhere you turn these days, it seems. The idiot on the hillside, the lazy stealing language and calling it inspired, the prophet screaming at a screen, the poet writing policy and pretending it has meaning, the landlord counting pebbles, the loaded drawing borders and separating peoples, the empire claiming histories they've stolen, the holy hiding in cathedrals, the rigid tightening their backs. We see the spark and believe it's some new fire. Nothing's new, and nothing changes till we twist our spines to truth and see behind us. Revolutions are useless without a little Volta. Behold the lowly fallen far behind us. Behold their buried stories. Behold the Sodom city and the angels on their heels. Behold the fire burning and the shaping of us all. For me, this poem, Twisted, is about turning our spine to look backwards into history. I heard, since Brexit, since other things that have happened since 2016, people saying, God, things have gotten bad now. And it's the now and gotten that we should be having trouble with. Because for some people, things were never good. And maybe there's a little bit of relief that more people are recognizing, there's a time of crisis, or there's a compulsive and addictive behavior when it comes to what the bolshy, boisterous leadership looks like, and the tolerance of that in wider society. But that's nothing new. I mean, there's been 400 years of colonization. The biggest terrorism act that the world has ever seen. All pretty much led by Christians. Changing languages, lands, people. And so much that's often called culture. We watch Downton Abbey and think all that money came from, I don't know, just being rich. Not trading in peoples who had their own land and lives and families and places to live all across East and West Africa. How is it that we look at these things and see them as entertainment rather than see them as the kind of luxurious top level of the diabolical nature of stealing places from people and stealing people from places also. So to look behind us, I think, is really important. I think that history is calling us. History is calling us to pay attention to a moral practice. And I know we're here to talk about poetry that can calm the heart, but the heart is a piece of meat, and unless we look to the past, we're not treating the piece of meat that is the heart seriously enough. It needs to beat sometimes with shame. I have no problem with shame. Shame is getting a lot of bad rap these days. But when you look to the history of Britain, when you look to the history of Ireland, Ireland likes to blame the British for everything. But we've got plenty to be blamed for ourselves. And so I do think that there needs to be a way within which our hearts are seized with something called civic shame for the kinds of things that is worthy of being civically shamed about in order, please God, to make some kind of difference and to enact something of change. So they're not all going to be heavy poems. There's a few things there. But most of them are, because it's really worthwhile being drawn into difficulty for various things. I was sitting around a table a few years ago with some people, and there was a 25-year-old there, and the 25-year-old said something about the Troubles. And This was only a few years ago, and somebody else around the table said to the 25-year-old, "You're too young to know about the Troubles." And the person who said this was a very renowned man of peace. And the young man said the following, I can find it. This poem's called Not Yet. "You're too young to know about the Troubles," the peace man said. And the young man said, "Father shot dead, mother fell apart, brother fell into himself, other brother sent to live with others, and me, I smothered everything. I was farmed around, and now years later we have found ourselves back beneath a shared and troubled ceiling." Not yet. No one's too young to know about the Troubles. There's a worrying thing that we forget the past very quickly, even though the past took a very long time to happen. In that poem Twisted earlier on, there's a line in it that says, "And we see the spark and believe it's some new fire." We're so quick to turn away from the past. And I think we need to alert ourselves to the reality that the past is a big monster and is worthy of a lot of our time. John Paul Lederach has a theory that, and it's not only his, he's kind of echoing it, I suppose, that conflicts take as long to de-escalate as they took to escalate. And so the most crude reading of the difficulties of British-Irish relations might begin from 1921 at partition to 1998 at the peace agreement. The beginning of the peace agreement, of course. Peace wasn't arrived at in 1998, it just started. That's 77 years. So really the best time to imagine when you can, on the first level, ask about the normalization of relationships of British Irishness is in 2075. Okay? And that's taking a very, very minimal reading of the 800 years of British Irish difficulties. When you think of enslavement in this continent, in this north part of the continent, 250 years after 1864, 1865, is the earliest time when you can begin to imagine that serious questions about, let's measure the normalization of how our reparation initiatives and commitments of 250 years, how valuable and serious have they been. That's the first time when that should be begun to be imagined, rather than, we had an apology last year, come on, let's get over it. So time for me is a very important thing, and the necessity of looking to the past, and the necessity of recognizing where it is we live, and with that, how to nurture the heart in the middle of all of that. And the United States Library of Congress in the last few months has asked, and she accepted, Joy Harjo to be the Poet Laureate. Joy Harjo is the first Indigenous person of the United States to be brought into this role. The role of Poet Laureate of the United States is an extraordinary role. Tracy K. Smith just recently completed 2 terms that the Library of Congress had asked her to do. And I wanted to read a poem for you from Joy Harjo's not most recent collection, because she has a collection called, I forget, is it American Sunset or American Sunrise? You might remember. Anyway, it came out a few months ago. It's a great book. But previous to that, in 2015, she had a book called Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, which, of course, a book of poetry called Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings. I might have only bought about 10 copies. And it's in your handout there, and in the central column of page 2. You see that. There's a poem here called This Morning I Pray for My Enemies. You see that? This morning I pray for my enemies. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend. It's so worthwhile to hear that poem. I'll read it again. as I read it, notice it's a collection of single lines. I mean, because of the way that it's laid out here, I put some of these lines on a second line, but the way it's presented in the book, it's just this series of end-stop lines. It's a really interesting series of statements, almost like some series of commandments to us. There's great power in what she says. The gentleness of this morning, I pray for my enemies, and then these statements. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend. It's an extraordinary locating of this question of enmity that we have. Who is an enemy? And who should we call an enemy? What does it mean to use this word enemy? For so many of us, to hear the word enemy, it all automatically might mean that somebody's going to open up the door to the question of annihilation, or subjugation, or subordination, or dominance. That the question of enemy automatically leads into the question of power. And what Joy Harjo is doing here so elegantly, and which she does in so many of her poems, is to take a word like that and to turn it around entirely, to say there's an absolute different way to do that. And for her, you see that in the third line there, I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. So often there's this grounded spirituality in her poetry, where some aspect of the natural world is the thing that grounds her into an ethic of being. Over and over again in this book, and in many of her books, you will find that she uses land from her own poetic invention, as well as from her own rich tradition from the Muscogee Creek nation. The way that she says, I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. That enmity is only the beginning of a serious question, rather than the ending. Enmity should open us up to a question of a door into the heart and into something different. This is what she's proposing. The heart, the smaller cousin of the sun, sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing even as it hears the blessing. Look at that word gnashing, that silent G. It's brilliant to have it in there. It's delicious. It's such a glorious thing in a poem to have the word gnashing. Because even though you're not saying that word, that you're not sounding that G, you're hearing it. You're hearing something in your throat, something that isn't being voiced, something that is saying, let me be voiced even though I'm not going to be heard. I think there is something that is seeking to be voiced, even though it's not often heard, in the question of enmity. Perhaps we do need this word enemy in the world. Lots of us, I think, in the peace traditions would love to think we could live in a world where we don't even need that word in our languages. However, unfortunately, I think we do need the word. What we certainly can do is to turn around the way we speak about it. Regularly when I've been doing peace work, I have felt like, as a gay Catholic man, that people would speak to me as if LGBT people are enemies of morality. Regularly people have said there was a troll recently who's been writing horrible things about me. And part of me wants to say, I think you belong to a tradition that has a lot to say about enmity. Like, I think you're supposed to love me. If I am devil incarnate, I think you're supposed to love me. Love your enemies is what we read in these texts that people often use to arm themselves with strong words that hate. When actually enmity should be the beginning of an equation of love and a commitment of something that unsettles us, because it leads us to a deep sense of belonging. As Joy Harjo says, an enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend. And one wonders, how would an enemy get in? Is it because they sneak in, or because we open the door to the heart and they accidentally get in? I think it's the latter that she's proposing, although there's some mysterious question here as to how an enemy might get in. Conscious, is this microphone moving in and out of different? Is it? Is that when I turn my head, or is it just? So should I just treat myself like I don't have a neck? Okay, I don't have a neck for this.
It's probably like we can always revert to the other mic, in which case.
Okay. Oh, my tea.
John, is yours off? There may also be feedback.
Is what off?
Is yours off?
Mine is off.
Okay. Well, let's see if it lasts for a bit. It's taking
I
over.
think it's lasting for a bit. It might be that this is not connected very well either.
Okay.
It kind of needs to have its.
Oh, okay. Needs to be here.
It might. It doesn't want this. This wants to be in connection with our. That door to be open to over there.
Okay. Let's see what works.
If it doesn't, I'm ready to.
Okay. A number of years ago, I was part of an experiment, which was an experiment of peace, which brought together people from all kinds of political and religious points of view on the island of Ireland, North and South, Catholic and Protestant, Unionist and Nationalist and Loyalist and Republican, people who thought that Northern Ireland was a place that should be changed, that Ireland should be reunited, people that wanted to make sure that the union between Northern Ireland and England, Scotland and Wales is protected and continues. And we were together in a room for 3 days. And just to add to it, we also had people from all kinds of points of view, political and religious, from Israel and Palestine in the same. And we had given ourselves 3 days, not to solve anything, but to see what happens. Can we talk with each other? Because there's this imagination sometimes that peace means consensus, or peace means total agreement, or that peace means even common ground. And I am unconvinced that peace means any of those things. I think peace is a muscle of argument. Peace is a hope to think we can have a surprising engagement about things that we imagined would divide us and would be unspeakable. We can say things of deep disagreement to each other and say them with a lot more commitment than shouting or threatening each other requires. It's fairly easy to shout at or threaten somebody. Lots of us are well practiced in it. It's pretty predictable. You can usually write the script for shouting or threatening before it happens. What's very difficult to write the script for is surprise. And how can we be together with each other in a way that might open us up to a surprise? And thinking about poetry that can nurture the heart, I'm very interested in us exercising the imagination of surprise and the muscle of surprise. Imagining that humanity can be with each other in a way where congregations of humans, where we imagine that everything that they say will be predictable and downtrodden and sad, or something really surprising might come out of it. So there's a poem called Pedagogy of Conflict that I'll read for you. It's in 3 parts. They echo 3 sets of conversations that happened in the course of that time. The first section of this poem is about a person, both of whose parents worked in the police, and as a result this person was taught how to lie as a child, because to acknowledge that your parents were working in the security services was to open yourself up to being a legitimate target. And then the second poem is a person who grew up in a paramilitary family where every door in the house had a padlock on it, and they were told never open up the door. Even if you think it's your friend calling from school, never open up the door, because you never know who's behind. And she did once, and it was like a bad movie, the very worst thing that she could have done. And the third part of this poem reflects on a time when different people in the room, lots of people in the room had murdered somebody, and different people in the room argued about what the correct verb to use was. Is it murder? Is it take a life? Somebody proposed that you should just say, nah, a life was lost because of my involvement. And these are serious questions of conjugating a sentence together. And, people live and die based on that. There were people there who'd been in armies, so they said, never use the word murder when I'm in an army, I'm just following orders. And lots of people felt like they were in armies, and then other people said, well, your army is a legitimate army or an illegitimate army. Somebody said, I only ever shot at legitimate targets. And then somebody said, well, that must have been me when I was 11, when your people shot at me. So these are the 3 parts of the poem, the pedagogy of conflict. When I was a child, I learned to lie. When I was a child, my parents said that sometimes lives are protected by an undetected light lie of deception. When I was a child, I learned to lie. Now, I am more than 25 and I'm alive because I've lied and I'm lying still. Sometimes it's the only way of living. When I was a child, I learned that I could stay alive by obeying certain rules. Let your anger cool before you blossom bruises on your brother's shoulder. Always show your manners at the table. Always keep the rules and never question. Never mention certain things to certain people. Never doubt the reasons behind legitimate aggression. If you compromise or humanize, you must still even out the score. And never open up the door. Never open up the door. Never, never, never open up the blasted door. When I was a child, I learned that I could stay alive by obeying certain rules. Never open up the door. When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days, I've been counting lives, so I count one life. One life. One life. One life. One life. Because each time is the first time that that life has been taken. Legitimate target has 16 letters and one long, abominable space between two dehumanizing words. Poems operate on so many levels. For the poet, I think, I'm not sure where they operate on levels for the people who are listening, but the Irish word for poem is dawn, D-A-N, with an accent over the A to make it long, dawn. And the Irish word for poet is filla. So they're etymologically unrelated. So the poet is doing something that has no relation to the word for the poet. So the filla is writing dawn. You get what I'm saying? Rather than the poet writing poetry. And what I really like about that, because the word dawn, it comes from the word for destiny. What I really like about that is that there's the understanding that art comes from out with, and that the poet might just be the unlucky idiot who happens to be in the way. Or the person, who doesn't have a proper job, so therefore he has time to write, or she has time to write, or they have time to write. How is it that we can somehow find poetry that writes us rather than we writing it? And I think that's the hope for all of us engaging in poetry, is that it kind of doesn't matter what the original poet meant, because if the poem matters to you, well then you've made it mean something new, even if that is outside what the original poet meant or thought it should mean. That Pedagogy of Conflict poem, it has that line, legitimate target has 16 letters and one long, abominable space between two dehumanizing words. The word abominable there had been on my mind, and I hadn't realized how desperate I was to redeem the word abominable, because the word in English is very well known for being a translation of a Hebrew word, toeva. A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is a toeva, is the word in Hebrew, toeva. Translated into English as abominable, an abomination. In Irish, a dofrucht, and that word is an old name for monster. So it's a frightening and terrorizing word, really. And one of the things that I think poetry is an attempt by the community of people to write a new scripture, to say, there isn't scripture enough to speak to this experience yet. Where can I find it? Nowhere yet. I'll write my own. Or maybe my own will write me. And to find some way to enter into some new language that births a new permission to be in us. And that's the whole hope, is that poetry and maybe prayer too are attempts to birth a permission to be in the community, to find a way where we can say, we don't have a way to bless this yet, We don't have a way to honour it. We don't have a way to lament it or to gasp in horror at it. Let's make it. Scriptures are not finished. Let's continue to write them. I'll look at a couple of poems here from people who are doing that very thing. First of all, from the most magnificent Emily Dickinson, on page 2 of 2, over on the right-hand side. I love Emily Dickinson, clearly. Today, I signed a contract that in 2022 I'm going to write a book through the year with Emily Dickinson. So 52 readings with Emily Dickinson. And you won't understand her after you read that book, because she's ununderstandable. That's the whole point. The whole point is to take a safari through her work and hope that you come out alive. In the meantime, listen to what she does here. I think maybe lots of you, clearly this is used in North America as well, a nighttime prayer. And now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. A lovely planning to die for every child. Interestingly, so much of children's literature and old lullabies and old prayers for children mention death. We become a lot, in this idea that we progress as society, actually we become a lot more frightened of death. And older literatures and children's literature continues to not be frightened of that. I have a friend who works in children's literature in New York City, and he continues to say, look at children's literature and don't think that children makes it diminutive. This is literature for the world, for us to pay attention to the serious questions about what it means to be alive and to face death regularly. So here's what Emily Dickinson does with that poem. Now I lay thee down to sleep. I pray the Lord thy dust to keep. And if thou live before thou wake, I pray the Lord thy soul to make. What is she on about? I have no idea. Which is the great joy, to the frustration of my friend Jude over there, who says, I don't want to go on a safari, I want to understand a little bit. But what she's doing is she's taking something that's in the lexicon, she's taking something that you might have recited that prayer to yourself for a long time, but yet, as soon as I started, you're able to recite it off, like it's inside you, like a little devil, which it probably is. And she is turning things around. I lay thee down to sleep. Who is she laying down to sleep? Herself? Somebody else? And I pray the Lord thy dust to keep. Maybe every sleep is some kind of indication of a death. Perhaps that's a way to speak about it. From dust you came, to dust you will return. An imagining of the death. Is she burying somebody? What's happening? We have no idea. And then it changes. And if thou live before thou wake. The if here is so insightful because it points us to the idea of saying, what does it mean to live a life? What does it mean to be alive even when we're alive? Because perhaps not all of us are all the time. We all know you can lose a night, a week, a year, a decade, sometimes by not alerting yourself to the possibility of surprise in human encounter. She's praying somehow that it might be possible to live before we wake. She's also speaking perhaps a little bit about dreams. And then she says, I pray the Lord thy soul to make. It's 4 lines with those 4 infuriating M-dashes at the end of it, which her first editors took out. And her first editors took out all the capital letters in her poetry, apart from the beginning line. They took out all of the M-dashes. They also, what they said, perfected her rhymes, because regularly she uses slant rhyme, or something. She knows perfectly how to rhyme, as you can see here, but regularly she'll just mess with you, and she'll have something which looks like a rhyme but doesn't sound like one, or just sounds a little bit like it that you just almost want to ache it in. It's like if somebody ends a song on the wrong note, and part of you hurts to go, no, move it up, move it up, move it up. But she does that all the time. And it's not because she's unable to do perfect writing, it's because she is, and because she's messing. She's like Picasso in writing to say, I'm going to put 2 eyes on top of each other. And somebody might have gone, but it's inaccurate. And she's saying, yeah, but it's accurate. Because it brings us into that. So regularly, the point isn't that that she's comprehensible. The point is that she's doing something to alert frustration, perhaps, in us. And she wrote this poem toward the end of her life. she's taking a poem about what does it mean to be alive. And lurking in these 4 lines is something about love, something about sleep, something about being truly awakened, and something about dreams. In 4 simple lines, which is quite genius. But clearly the prayer, "and now I lay me down to sleep," wasn't adequate enough. She wished to make a new scripture, a new prayer, to enter something into us, to help us to be awake and alert. The poem directly underneath it, Book of Genesis from Kai Miller, is doing a very similar thing. I'll tell you about Kai Miller. And he is a Jamaican poet. He lives in England now. He's been living between England and Scotland for about the last maybe 12, 13 years. He's a renowned poet. He won the Forward Prize a few years back for a magnificently titled book. The book that won the Forward Prize, which was a huge prize in the English language poetry world. The book that won the prize a few years ago is called "The Cartographer Tries to Map the Way to Zion." So, I mean, you should win it for that title alone. And it is an extraordinary book, really worthwhile reading. However, the poem that we're going to look at is not from that book, it's from an earlier one. "There is an Anger That Moves" is the book, published by Kavanagh, a great publisher in Manchester, England. This poem is part of a sequence of Bible poems where he goes into a book of the Bible and just decides to rewrite it. But he's not trying to summarize it. He's trying to lighten it. He's trying to distill it. It's almost a transcendence. And he pushes through a biblical text, as you see he does here, quite brilliantly. Book of Genesis. "Suppose there was a book full only of the word let, from whose clipped sound all things began, fir and firmament, feather the first whale, and suppose we could scroll through its pages every day to find and pronounce a let meant only for us. We would stumble through the streets with open books, eyes crossed from too much rhyme, too much reading. We would speak in auto-rhyme. The world would echo itself, and still we'd continue in runs, saying let and let and let, until even silent dreams had been allowed." He summarizes an entire book with the simple word let, coming in the English translation from the idea that the God character in chapter 1 is saying, "Let there be light, let there be let." That, interestingly, isn't present in Hebrew, because in Hebrew God just says light in this extraordinary, explosive form of a verb that creates as it says. However, the English translation allows us for this beautiful imperative, let. And Kai Miller summarizes. But the first thing he does is he says this word, suppose. Isn't that extraordinary? Everything here is built on an imagination. The usage of the word suppose here allows us to imagine that maybe he's speaking about make-believe. Maybe he doesn't believe in the Bible at all. Maybe he doesn't believe in God. But he's saying, just suppose. And so there's a glorious agnosticism here to the question about where is it that things are created from. And I love the dedication to that here. He is not trying to pronounce any kind of certitude. He is trying to pronounce something that says, look at what might be possible if we use the imagination in a way that gives permission. Because then things become possible. Maybe we can measure those things. But that which nurtures the heart, to try to measure it is probably the wrong metric. We should turn to things that work rather than things that we can prove when it comes to the question of the heart. And so suppose there was a book full only of the word let, and from whose clipped sound all things began. What's brilliant about the word clipped here is that it clips. It creates that sonic. And what he's doing is he's choosing a word, he's brilliant at this throughout all this work. He's choosing a word that is deeper than onomatopoeia. You know, this isn't just like saying buzz, okay? Or the Irish word for describing when porridge is bubbling is called plubbernig. It's brilliant. That's the most fantastic example of onomatopoeia. But he says clipped. And this is deeper than just the humour and the delicious nature of onomatopoeia. This is making us realise that words have power, because we've just said clip and we've just heard a clip. And then we have this beautiful alliteration, fur and firmament, feather, the first whale, beautiful. And suppose we could scroll through its pages every day and pronounce a let meant only for us. How interesting that he speaks in the plural here, for us. We would, still we'd continue in rounds. He's speaking somehow about being gathered together in community, and that the human hunger to belong and the human hunger to feel spoken into being is a shared hunger. In as much as it's individual, perhaps individually people will be looking through this book, looking for the let meant only for them. However, that is somehow a corporate and a community and a congregational activity. His dedication, because he easily could have used a single there, meant only for you, meant only for me. It would have been easy to have done. He could have absolutely modified that. We stumbled through the streets with open books, eyes crossed from too much reading, and we would speak in auto-rhyme. The world would echo itself, and still we'd continue in rounds saying let and let and let. The repetition of let and let and let. Repetition in three is somehow very satisfactory, but also there's a glorious liquid sound. Ooh and in English are described as liquid sounds. And so by speaking with liquid sounds in this repetition of let and let and let, and then it's repeated a little bit in an echo with aloud later on in that final word. And that aloud can be understood as aloud with permission, but if you only heard it, you might think aloud as in that which is audible also. So this word too has two different ways to hear it, depending as to whether you've heard it or seen it, and everything that's there. The hope for the heart is that we might turn not to that which is most provable to nurture the heart, but that which works. For a long time I was looking for the right kind of spirituality, I remember once going to a lecture and somebody spoke about Benedictine spirituality and Jesuit spirituality and Franciscan spirituality and all these other kinds of spiritualities and Quaker spirituality. They were just speaking within the Christian traditions, and then they were saying, and of course then you've got the Sufi tradition and you've got the Kabbalah tradition. I was so confused to think which one, do I need to study them all to know which one I should go towards, and which is the best, or which one is the most recommendable, where should you start? Where should you imagine you'll go towards? And those are all the wrong questions. The real question is which one works for you? And have you found one that works? If you have, you don't need to imagine that you're going to progress on to anything else. Maybe you will. Maybe that will last for a while and then you'll be drawn into a dark night of the soul from which something new will come, or maybe it'll just continue to work. And so to pay attention to what's working is a really important call when it comes to the question of the heart and what nurtures us in the heart. If you turn over the page to the poem there called Creed by Meg Carney, I'll tell you about Meg Carney. Some of you might know Meg Carney's work. I can hear little murmurs of delight because she's a delightful and brilliant and raucous and insightful poet. She also writes young adult literature about adoption. That's what she's been writing more recently. But this is a poem from her book, An Unkindness of Ravens, which is a delightful title. The collective noun in English for ravens is an unkindness, which is fascinating. English is the only language that has collective nouns. There are no other languages that have collective nouns. A blessing of unicorns, a flamboyance of flamingos. Gorgeous, I say that one. Collective nouns began in monasteries in England when the abbots of the monasteries had nothing better to do. So they used to write these little chapbooks of collective nouns, and the abbot of the St. Albans monastery just north of London clearly didn't like Scottish people because he included, because it's typically animals that you use collective nouns for, and although not always, but he had a collective noun for Scottish people called a heresy of Scots. I have never met a Scottish person who isn't delighted by that. He just goes, yes, thank you very much, we accept it. So the whole book that Meg Carney has is called An Unkindness of Ravens. The book that came after was Home by Now. It's a really interesting book because it was published just after 9/11. She lived, I think she might have grown up in Manhattan, and she moved from Manhattan after 9/11, and planes and looking up in a way that's frightened occur over and over and over again in that but the book that comes after this. I think she's a fantastic poet. But this is the first poem of hers that I ever came across, and I think it is quite magnificent. Creed. I believe the chicken before the egg, though I believe in the egg. I believe eating is a form of touch carried to the bitter end. I believe chocolate is good for you. I believe I'm a lefty in a right-handed world, which does not make me gauche or abnormal or sinister. I believe normal is just a cycle on the washing machine. I believe the touch of hands is the power to heal, though nothing will ever fill this immeasurable hole in the center of my chest. I believe in kissing. I believe in mail. I believe in salt over the shoulder. A watch pot never boils, and if I sit by my mailbox waiting for the letter I want, it will never arrive. Not because of superstition, but because that's not how life works. I believe in work. Phone calls, typing, multiplying, black coffee, write, dig, sweep. I believe in a slow, tortuous sweep of tongue down the lover's belly. I believe I've been swept off my feet more than once, and it's a good idea not to name names. Digging for names is part of my work. That's a different poem. I believe there's a difference between men and women, and I thank God for it. I believe in God, and if you hold the door and carry my books, I'll be sure to ask for your name. What is your name? Do you believe in ghosts? I believe the morning my father died, I heard him whistling Danny Boy in the bathroom, and a week later saw him standing in the living room with a suitcase in his hand. We never got to say goodbye, he said, and I said, I don't believe in goodbye. I believe that's why I have this hole in my chest. Sometimes it's rapid. Sometimes it's incoherent. I believe I'll survive. I believe early to bed and early to rise is a boring way to live. I believe good poets borrow, great poets steal, and if only we'd stop trying to be happy, we could have a pretty good time. I believe time doesn't heal all wounds. I believe in getting flowers for no reason. I believe give a hoot, don't pollute. Reading is fundamental. Yankee Stadium belongs in the Bronx, and the best bagels in New York are boiled and baked on the corner of 1st and 21st. I believe in Santa Claus, Jimmy Stewart, Zuzu's Petals, Arbor Day, and that ugly baby I keep dreaming about. She lives inside me, opening and closing her wide mouth. I believe she will never taste her mother's milk. She will never be beautiful. She will always wonder what it's like to be born. And if you hold your hand right here, touch me right here, as if this is all that matters, this is all you ever wanted, I believe something might move inside me and it would be more than I could stand. What a roller coaster of a poem. I mean, up and down and sadness and little hints at the start of something that's a little bit more malicious than the fun that she's creating. She holds all these serious things together, and she holds this one, I don't believe in goodbyes. She holds that together in all this long list of goodbyes. I wonder if that was the whole point of the poem, was to find a way to hide the don't believe. Sometimes that's what happens with a poem. A poet has an idea for one line and then says, I need to hide it somewhere. So let me hide it in a long poem. Let me build into that. And not just make it the final line, but hide it in the middle somewhere. I don't know if that's the case, but certainly sometimes that's what a poet does. This overwhelming way that the poem culminates then in that ugly baby I keep dreaming about. How often is it that somebody says something about an ugly baby? It's strong language to use by putting that word ugly there. We want to resist it. But she makes it work so powerfully. The wide mouth, never taste her mother's milk, will never be beautiful, will always wonder what it's like to be born. And if you hold your hand right here, who's you? Is it us? Is it herself? Is it her dead father? Who is the you? Is it the whole world? Is it the universe, as people sometimes speak about? Is it God? Who is you? Who might bring her there? Is it a lover? Is it a former lover? Is it her actual child? None of us know. And somehow by doing that, she's speaking to a shared experience that we have, in the sense of the privacy of knowing the inner world and the vulnerability of our inner world being in conversation with the outer world. She's calling us in the middle of being brilliant at the art of conflict avoidance. This is a great poem about conflict avoidance in a certain sense, towards the end especially. But she's calling us to pay attention to the inner life. And even to just be aware, to say there are things that if you touch me, I might scream. There are things that I will not have control over. There are things inside the heart that are complex, and I don't know what to do about them. And so when we think about poems to touch the heart, poems of the heart, poems to nurture the heart, we need to remember that the heart comes with many rooms, and some of those rooms are unexplored, and some of those rooms are locked by us for all kinds of reasons. And accidentally sometimes something can get into the heart and disturb us. And to open ourselves to this is to open ourselves to surprise, but surprise isn't always delicious. Sometimes surprise is complicated. We're called to it though. And those rooms are there whether or not we like to open the doors. And what I really like about May Carney's poem is how aware she is about this ugly baby she keeps dreaming about, carrying around with her. And how that ugly baby calls for attention, even though the ugly baby is also calling not to have attention. All at the same time. It's there and not there. Pay attention to it, she's talking about it, but she's also saying, back off. Don't touch it, because it might be more than she could stand. She is magnificent. When it comes to thinking about how we can say surprising things, so often we're caught in repeated patterns, and I regularly have been and regularly am. And I was in Newark Airport once, and I had just landed in Newark Airport for a long flight from Belfast, and the flight had been delayed, and then when we got there our bags were a bit delayed, and I had to go through immigration, and there had been 4 or 5 flights that were all delayed at the same time, so loads of flights landed, and going through immigration in Newark, everybody was friendly, but it just took a long time, and then the bags were delayed, and I was waiting and waiting, and then I saw a former colleague. So here's a poem called Returnings. It's pretty much true to exactly what happened. Returnings. I see her, former colleague, in the baggage area of a foreign airport. Oh, hi, she says, looking awkwardly toward the empty carousel. Then she decides, I hear you're gay now, she says. Are you still a Christian? Oh, how will we tell this story? She, to her friends with sadness, curiosity and prayers for reorientation and returning. Me to mine, with sadness, anger and prayers for refocusing the lenses and returning. And the anger was all mine, but that question was all about her. Should we not just dance instead, I should have said. Together turn a little waltz in the chorus of our own bodies, while we wait and wait and wait for something better than the empty carousel of this question. How will we tell this story? How will I tell this story? With sadness, with practicings of little ballroom dances, while we wait confidently for what is most important to be returned. The question was annoying. A, about the idea of gay, and B, about what the word Christian means. I mean, it was just a little bit mad. We haven't spoken much as colleagues when we were colleagues. Never mind 10 years later when we were awkwardly sweaty people around a carousel in Newark Airport. But the way the conversation went was totally predictable. And part of me thought, what would it be like to prepare to say something unexpected when the most expectable thing is said? What would it be like to interrupt predictable conversation with something that just says, really? Like, do you have a good joke? You know, not just for the sake of avoidance, but for the sake of transcending something, bringing us to a different imagination about who we can be. One time at the end of a conference, somebody came up to me and she said, I just found out right now that you are a homosexual. I was like, oh, this is years ago when I was less out. And I said, right, yes, hello, Pádraig, nice to meet you. And she said, I want to compliment you because I need to tell you that you passed really well. I wouldn't have thought you were a homosexual at all. Yeah. No, I knew who she was. We didn't know each other, but I knew she was a friend of a friend. And I knew that my friend, our mutual friend, had said that she had a great sense of humor. So I said, well, I want to compliment you, because when I see you, I wouldn't think that you're a heterosexual at all. And there was a little moment. And then she smiled. She said, oh, God, did I sound like that? And I went, yeah, I'm telling you. And we laughed at her. And then I found myself thinking, you are a laugh. And suddenly we didn't need to talk about, you know, surprising and passing or anything like that. There was just this moment of we've laughed with each other. And it wasn't that we avoided the thing. There was learning, there was a little bit of confrontation, but there also was something that meant that the next time I saw her, I was like, how's it going? How's your wife? And she just laughed, and it was fun. And so part of me thinks, not that that would necessarily work in high-level diplomatic negotiations, I'm not proposing that. But I am proposing that there might be something in the heart, that the heart doesn't need to be trapped into things that just lead us down really, really predictable paths. So, I'm going to say a few more poems and then we can have a few questions and I can finish off with a few poems. Pádraig Kavanagh is a poet who I love, and you see his poem there, it starts in the centre column, page 2. He is a fascinating poet from County Monaghan, which is an Ulster county, and I think it's fair enough to say that he was something of a poetic prodigy. And he was called to poetry as a child. There was a lot of poetry in the school curriculum, you would have heard a lot. From what I read, that there was one anthology of poetry in the parish. The priest owned it, and the priest used to lend it to him. And he was an extraordinary man of great insight. He's a huge, huge influence on Seamus Heaney. And the sonic quality of farmland and agricultural Irish life in the early part of the 20th century echoes throughout so much of his poetry, as well as the deep and serious questions about God and what God might mean. And he had always dreamt of arriving in Dublin to be part of the literature community in Dublin. The Dublin literature community, Yeats was there and all these others, and it was very thriving. And when he got there, they had all been writing about the peasant poet. They were all delighted. There were fairly well-to-do English-speaking poets, mostly in the Dublin Literature Society, who were writing deliciously about this fantasized peasant poet. And then one arrived and they fucking hated him. Hated him terribly. Because he was better than all of them. Of course he was. He was genius. He inhabited something that was just amazing. And he lived, I think, I might regret saying this, but it seems to me in my reading of lots of his writing for much of his adult life, he lived in deep bitterness. He had a literary magazine which never made money, even though it was very renowned, which was scathing, written with the ink of poison at times. I mean, he could write brilliantly, but if he criticized your work, he criticized your work. He used lots of his creativity for dragging things down. And late in his 50s, two things happened. He fell in love, and he got a serious diagnosis, from which he eventually died about 8 years later. And he began, toward the end of his life, it seems to me, to turn back toward the land that had nurtured and sustained him, to turn back toward an indigenous, intuitive understanding of the rural, culture bogland from which he'd come, that for many people would have been an object of disdain. How could a great poet come from the culture boglands of Monaghan, rather than, the supposed great city of Dublin? And this poem called The One he wrote late in his life, and it's beautiful. You hear in it a reference to the muse at her toilet. You know, he arrived in Dublin, and lots of people in the Dublin Literature Societies would have known lots about Greek and Norwegian or Nordic myths, as well as lots of them would have understood Arabic, read Arabic as well as Hebrew, and it was a very, very cultured literary society in that way, which is a great thing, provided you don't turn it into snobbery. And what he's doing is he now knows these things, but he's able to turn it back to say, actually, I don't need to know these things. The bogland is enough. So just as a little bit of etymology, bog in English, do you use that word in the States for bogland? It's one of the few words in the English language that comes from Irish. Bog, B-O-G, in Irish means soft. So when we talk about bogland, we're talking about soft land. So the one. Green, blue, yellow and red. God is down in the swamps and the marshes, sensational as April and almost incredible, the flowering of our catharsis, a humble scene in a backward place where no one important ever looked. The raving flowers looked up in the face of the one and the endless, the mind that has balked the profoundest of mortals, a primrose, a violet, a violent wild iris, but mostly anonymous performers, yet an important occasion as the muse at her toilet, prepared to inform the local farmers that beautiful, beautiful, beautiful God was breathing his love by a cutaway bog. He does such confident things here. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful God was breathing his love by a cutaway bog. Listen to those plosives, the but, 5 of them. Extraordinary, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful God. But even back up earlier on, a primrose, a violet, a violent wild iris. There's just such abundance of language. He is creating this sense of tremendous flourishing and bringing us into the recreation. You almost feel like you're participating in witnessing a moment in the Book of Genesis, describing when the boglands of Monaghan were made. Let there be bogland. Let there be beautiful bogland, the God is saying. And Patrick Kavanagh is watching over the God's shoulder, watching it all happen, and not feeling like he's missing out because he's not at these great places like the muse at her toilette, not feeling like he's missing out because he's not among the glitterati and literati. In many ways, this is a poem on the other side of comparison. I think that's an important thing to say when it comes to the question of the heart, because so often we feel like we should compare, and comparison is something that doesn't know how to die, it just builds and builds and builds. And he here is on the other side of comparison. I think this poem is a relevant one for people in an age where this question of attention and fame has become, it seems, problematic. And he is saying it's okay to be in a small corner where no one important ever looked, to be part of a humble scene in a backward place. He's using great irony to throw those things out, because as he describes it, there's nothing humble or backward in the abundance of life and the glory of creation here. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful God, breathing his love by a cutaway bog. Overwhelming. Such beauty. Take a few questions in a sec, but I will finish with one poem now, and a few questions, and then I'll finish with 2 more after that. I've been convinced for a long time that the question about how to belong in community is deeply related to how to be alone. I think when people, sometimes I see people in workplaces or in religious communities or communities of goodwill or intentional communities, and they're asking their friends or their spouses or their families or their workplaces or their religious belonging to do things for them that those places can't do for them. Workplaces as well. You know, how is it that my workplace can give me a sense of who I am in the world? It won't. It'll give you a check and hopefully a little bit of satisfaction. Yeah. There's other work for us to do for ourselves. And I think that loneliness, I'm not talking about isolation, although sometimes they do overlap. I think that loneliness and being alone calls us into some kind of conversation with the heart, which isn't necessarily satisfactory, but it is important and it is vital. There's one called How to Be Alone. And it's actually called How to Belong, but then belong is crossed out. And it says be alone afterwards. How to be alone. It all begins with knowing nothing lasts forever, so you might as well start packing now. In the meantime, practice being alive. There will be a party where you'll feel like nobody's paying you attention. And there will be a party where attention's all you'll get. What you need to do is to know how to talk to yourself between these parties. And again, there will be a day, a decade, where you won't fit in with your body, even though you're in the only body you're in. You need to control your habit of forgetting to breathe. Remember when you were younger and you practiced kissing on your arm? You were onto something then. Sometimes harm knows its own healing, comfort its own intelligence, kindness too, it needs no reason. There is a you telling you another story of you. Listen to her. Where do you feel anxiety in your body? The chest, the fist, the dream before waking, the head that feels like it's at the top of the swing, or the clutch of gut like falling and falling and falling and falling. It knows something. You are dying. Try to stay alive. For now, touch yourself. I'm serious. Touch yourself. Take your hand and place your hand someplace upon your body and listen to the community of madness that you are. You are such an interesting conversation. You belong here. So we'll take a few questions. And as John was saying, if you could use the microphone close to your mouth, the questions will be heard by everybody. It'd be lovely if you'd give your name as well.
Would you recognize people, please? Would you recognize people, call on them so I can...
All right. This one here.
Wanishi, they say Wanishi and Manape. Thank you. I'm very curious about restoring honor for the poet, restoring a culture of honor for poetry and peace, and the creativity and safe place of expression. So I'm curious what you might have experienced in the way of personal safe places to explore poetry and the courage to do poetry in public. And then also the honor for the ancient. I'm very fascinated by the balance between new and awkward and ancient and classic. And I really feel this is a weighty question because we are in a moment of learning to honor such ancient things that were denied. The Wallamolam is the greatest, longest, oldest poem on this continent, and it is not taught.
Thanks. So I feel very fortunate that I grew up in a culture that had and has great honor for poetry. So from the age of 5, we were learning off poetry in 2 languages off by heart every week. And that continued until we were 17, sitting poetry exams where you need to have memorized 80 poets and be able to comment on 80 poems to be able to comment on them, and you just get the question about the poem, and they wouldn't give you the text to comment, and you expected to know it off by heart. And I really like that. I've gone back to memorizing poetry while I brush my teeth. I recite it back to myself. So So I feel I'm very fortunate to have come from a culture. I suppose I was in school, I was born in 1975, I'm 44, but I suppose I was part of a culture, educational culture, that was beginning to move out of the idea of rote learning. But I think that there is a re-remembering that rote learning can be really good in certain things. And young children learning off poems about midlife crises at the age of 11 is great. You know? There's a great poem called Ihe Nulad Naman by Sean O'Riordan, that we learned off at the age of 11. And it really is about a midlife crisis. A lostness from Gobar an Arag is the last line. And the words are difficult to pronounce and to put in the same way. You know, how would you translate that? Something that lit the primal fire of anger. We were learning that off, and it's great. Who cares that we didn't know what we were on about? And so it did mean that when later on I turned to poetry, there was an imagination that poetry can use tough words. And you're asking about safe spaces, and for lots of poets, me included, poetry was about creating safe spaces because of their absence, and using rough words, using strong language. I've been writing a lot about the devil in the last few years because I went through some exorcisms to try to get rid of the gay devils in me, and I've felt the need to turn to tough, strong, raucous, blasphemous language sometimes to create something of my own sense of self in the middle of those memories of trauma and violence. And so sometimes poetry isn't about safe space at all, but other times it is. For me, it was a private art for about 20 years. I started writing when I was 11. And I barely told anybody till I was in my mid-20s, but I had hundreds of poems written by then because I needed it to survive, because there wasn't safe space, and so it became a safe space. So, and what you're saying about the oldest poem here on Turtle Island, how important it is to recognise how that old poems like that create us. That should probably be recited every morning at the beginning of school, rather than some other things. One here.
My name is Les Horning. Two-part question. First part, can everyone be a poet? Second part, if you were working with a group of adults and writing poetry, what would the adults have to unlearn before they could write poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose everybody can write poetry. The question is does everybody want to? You know, I suppose the point is to have some kind of conversation with yourself as a person. And different people will have that conversation in different ways. Some of the people it's going to be through dance. Some people will be through a long walk. Some people it might be through poetry. Some people it might be through reading or all kinds of other things, you know. So on the broad sense, yes. But it's not like I think it's the only way toward what's at the essence of poetry. At the essence of poetry is the internal conversation, and there's hundreds of ways to get there. I think the point is to listen to yourself and to know what draws you in there. And if you want to be drawn in, I would say that that's enough. So, to be drawn into writing it. Some of the things that's at the heart of needing to learn, you know, if you're thinking, how do I write poetry, but I'm not entirely sure, there has been such poor education about what poetry is. And the idea that young people or adults, when we're looking at a poem, should be asking, what does the poet mean? I'm not sure that's the first question. It is a good question. Sometimes there's some great things hidden at the heart of the poem, and a bit of technique can help you uncover what's there. But one of the questions should always be, how do you feel? What's happening to you when you're experiencing this? What was it like for you to try to read it out loud? Where would you put the emphasis? Where are you going? What's the music of it? What's the intelligence of it for you? Where does it sit in your body as you listen to it or as you recite it? And those are embodied experiences of poetry. And poetry, I think, is a very embodied art, provided you can enter into it. And the idea is to feel it in your body and to know that. So I think sometimes there are all kinds of techniques to trick yourself into writing poetry, which are great. You'll find loads of them online. Jericho Brown has a fantastic technique where he gets people to take a poem they love and to write the exact opposite to it. You know, so like Mary Oliver, people here probably love Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You absolutely have to be good. You need to walk on your knees through the desert for 1,000,000 miles praying. It's funny then you begin to discover this other dictionary of all these other words that are hidden under the thing that's said as all the things that aren't said. And so you begin to discern these layers of all these things you didn't use. And then suddenly you have this vocabulary for your own poem. And then you can just move into that. And they're echo poems. I mean, you wouldn't want to go trying to publish those things because they would absolutely be taken from her. But at the same time, it's where you go with it will be unique. Because you and the person next to you and the person next to you would each go in very different ways to write the empty wild goose poem. And so therefore, what's really interesting is to look at why did you go there? What is it in you that wants to go there rather than where the person next to you did? That's a very helpful way to mess around with the poem. But it does open up, it's playfully, it opens up the enjoyment and the delight of playing with language and to take something that you might love and to look at its diabolical heart and to see what you might make of that by messing up with it. So.
The question comes really from what you're saying and this idea of conversing about what's troubling between us. I didn't really ever get poetry until I started to read it out loud. And part of what you're saying about having the conversation is to hear the words out loud to yourself before you say them to another person. And so I'm just wondering if you have any, I don't know, you do that so well in what you write and what you read and how you teach. And so I just think there's probably something you could share with
Just
us.
practice reading it out loud. I mean, I am up early most mornings reading poetry for about an hour, and whoever I'm reading, I read it out loud. And it's glorious, because with Mark Doty, he's got a great book, it's called Alexandria is on the title, and you find yourself, you can read it and you hear the music in it, but when you're reciting the poetry, I regularly find myself stuttering and stumbling over, because he uses such interesting combination of consonants, and I think that's the whole thing. He was one of the first poets to, maybe not one of the first, but he certainly was part of that movement of engaging with HIV/AIDS, and so it should be difficult to say his poetry. So he's creating an embodied experience where it's hard to say the kind of things that he's saying, even though what he's saying is full of elegance and full of mystery and full of beauty, but it's hard to say it because he's approaching difficult things. And so to learn how to pay attention to going, instead of thinking, oh shit, at reading poems, to go, why is that one difficult? And to allow yourself the space to go, maybe I'm not the one at fault, and maybe the poet isn't at fault, maybe this is the point. And to allow that to be part of the intelligence of the poem. I have one that came out a while back that's meant to trip people up. I was writing the anti-Genesis, and it says, there's a line, breaths and rabies, and it's meant to trip people up to think breasts and babies, deliberately. And some people have said, I keep on saying breasts and babies. I'm like, yes. Because it's trying to trick us up in terms of predictable language. And so when people say, I struggled with saying that, I'm delighted. That's the whole point. So.
But just conversationally, if you're really trying to say something important to someone, the practice of reading the poem, I really can hear what they're trying to say. So to do that in our own selves, to try to understand our own feelings and experiences before we even say it to someone else, we're doing good, I think.
Yeah. There'll be lots of Quaker silence in between our conversations.
Quaker silence.
Is there another question?
It's not a question. It's
Maybe use the mic so that it can be picked up.
Well, I can talk louder.
I think it's so it can be picked up for the recording is the thing. Yeah. You, John?
Tom.
Tom.
This is a comment in regard to what you just said, and the question was previous. There has been, for the last 2 years, a class I teach at a prison, and it's poetry. And we always start by one prisoner, one student, reads a poem, and then we spend about 15 or 20 minutes doing what you've done elegantly. Talk about it, feel where it lands in us, what we hear from it, what we see in it, and then we read it again, and somebody else reads it. And each time, poetry is very communal, you know, the very thing that you said at the very outset, which is that the poet writes what the poet writes, and the reader hears what the reader hears. And you'd be surprised if you just repeat reading the poem after thinking about what it means. Strap it on either end, you'll come out with a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Thank you for your words.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions, or will I read? Oh, there's one here. Is that a question?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one here, and then I'll read a few more after that.
I have to add a little.
Remember, put it right up there.
When are you coming back to the area?
Next week, if Francisco's got anything to do with it.
Close to your mouth.
In my profession, there is a definition of what a creative person is. And it is, a creative person is a child that survived. I'm curious to hear your response.
Well, what's nice about that is that you can take the idea of survived in many ways. So a child that survived what? They can easily, I mean, people sometimes talk about, you know, the child within. I'm not entirely sure if I like that. It can feel a little bit tropish. Certainly the child in me needed to grow up and needed to discover new language, needed to learn how to swear and drink whiskey and use strong language in order to make sense of the world. Stuff I couldn't have done as a kid. But I did survive, and I survived things that I shouldn't have. And I didn't stay a child, but I did survive. So I can see the kind of diabolical heart of that sentence and be glad for it. So I like the idea that it can go in multiple ways. I'll finish with two poems. I won't talk about these, one of mine and one of somebody else's. The one of somebody else's is on the left-hand side of page 2 of 2, by Luke Kennard. I don't know Luke, but I send him messages every now and then to tell him how bloody brilliant he is. And when you hear this poem, you'll realise why, and why he's very funny on Twitter. So you realise why you should send him messages on Twitter to tell him how brilliant he is. And he'll reply, he's a laugh. So, of course. The choir hadn't left him alone since the first day of summer. He awoke to find them stationed around his bed. One day the choir arrived without warning or explanation, sang the choir in 4-part harmony, handing him toast. On his first day back at work, the choir stood at his desk singing, "The choir are making his professional life impossible." 2 weeks later, his partner left him for an osteopath. "Anna cannot stand the choir any longer," they sang. That night he pummeled the choristers with his fists. He beats the choir in frustration, but though they are bruised and bleeding at the lip, they sing with redoubled vigour, sang the choir. Then they sang, "He cannot go to sleep, he cannot get to sleep, he cannot get to sleep," in perfect fifths, until he fell asleep. "In time, you may even grow fond of us," they sang, quietly. Partly I use that poem because it's so funny and frightening. Like, what is it? Who are these people singing in 4-part harmony and in perfect fifths, repeating things 3 times, right there present? He's messing around with this inner voice, and I really like it. Some people have said to him, I messaged him to tell him how great this poem is in particular, and he was saying, well, some people say it's all about depression, and he goes, it might be, but it mightn't be. So, because certainly this could feel like something narrating you in a way that's full of pressure, but I love the playfulness of it in the middle of the predatory nature of this. I think what it does is it takes you a little bit to the edge, you feel a little bit of chaos, you feel like, I don't entirely know that the poem is entirely comprehensible, And the poet, Luke Kennard, goes, yeah, I know, me too. Which is just great. So I kind of wanted to read that poem for you just because it's beautiful and funny and really worthwhile. I'm going to finish with a poem called The Facts of Life. So The Facts of Life wasn't a television show in Ireland. It is in the States, is that right? The Facts of Life? It was, yeah. But in the States, is The Facts of Life also a way of talking about sex? So if you, like certainly for us back home, somebody would have said, you know, my parents told me about the facts of life this weekend. You know, they handed me a book awkwardly and ran away. My dad gave me a book about the facts of life when I was 15. And I said to him, we've learned all about this in biology, Dad. And he went, there's more to it than biology. And I said, we did it in religion as well. And then he went, read the book. Here's a poem called The Facts of Life, which is finishing and a blessing and filled with thanks and gratitude to you for coming here, and in the hope that our hearts might flourish and that we will write whatever scriptures we need to be alive to the world that we're in. The Facts of Life. That you were born and you will die. That you will sometimes love enough and sometimes not. That you will lie, if only to yourself. That you will get tired. That you will learn most from the situations you did not choose. But there will be some things that move you more than you can say. That you will live. That you must be loved. That you will avoid questions most urgently in need of your attention. That you began as the fusion of a sperm and an egg of two people who once were strangers and may well still be. That life isn't fair. That life is sometimes good and sometimes even better than good. That life is often not so good. That life is real. And if you can survive it well, with love and art and meaning given where meaning is scarce. That you will learn to live with regret. That you will learn to live with respect. That the structures that constrict you may not be permanently constricting. That you will probably be okay. That you must accept change before you die, but you'll die anyway. So you might as well live, and you might as well love. You might as well love. You might as well love. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming out this evening. Some of you may already have purchased one of the volumes of Pádraig's poetry. We have unfortunately sold out, but if you brought a book to be signed, Pádraig has graciously consented to do that out in the lobby where our refreshments are located. And if you would like to purchase from an independent bookstore, namely Pendle Hill, we're taking orders for the books even if you were not able to get one this evening, and we'll take care of getting them sent to you. So, thanks. Well, let us give one more